Okay, so this video is part two of the composition. Last time I posted a video, this drawing was in the very early stages, and well, it still kind of is in the early stages. I've been chipping away at it in my spare time. So basically what I've done in this stage is I've got the key figures placed in the composition. There's going to be many more, but these are the ones that I think are most visible. So I've started drawing the armor that lies on top of them, and I've got a couple of shields on the figures on the foreground there. But yeah, this is the bit where I start sketching in, not necessarily the detail, but just the armor. So the first stage of the drawing is to place the figures, get the proportions of the anatomy correct, without going too far into the details, obviously. And then once you've got the proportions in there and the perspective kind of more or less figured out, then you start drawing the armor on top of them. And so let's have a bit more of a closer view in here. So you can see there's a lot of figures in the foreground here, and I've got a couple of cavalry, got a couple of soldiers on horseback there with the oval shields. And this is still very early on in the drawing process. So again, I'm trying to avoid using references as much as I possibly can and just relying on perspective to figure out some of these problems with the drawing. So when you're in the early stages of the drawing in something like this, you really just want to keep focusing on perspective, you know, making sure that the angles look correct, making sure that the perspective of the equipment looks correct and all the figures. You can see this guy here, he's sort of adjusting his helmet, so his head is sort of lying in a different perspective from all the others. We've got a couple of figures in the foreground here, big group of them, and there's going to be more over here, like they're just going to sort of vanish towards the horizon line, so it's going to be a massive scene. But yeah, this stage of the drawing is just trying to get in, not the details, but just placing some of the armor in there, especially the shields. You can see how the shields sort of cover up the figures, and you can see how there's a bit of X-ray vision going on here, right? So, you know, like I've drawn, you know, the legs of the figures, you know, the side. I've even gone as far as to sketching some of the armor, only for it to be covered up by a big shield. And a lot of people think, you know, why would you go through the effort of, you know, drawing all of that detail if you're only going to cover it up? And the answer is because you don't quite know what's going to be visible and what is, right? You really need to sort of go the extra mile and sort of draw some figures in there. Even if they're not going to be completely visible, you still need to draw the placement of their feet, the waistline, so forth. You can see, like with the horse here, you can see the leg is here, but the leg now is sort of covered up by this rectangular shield. But the other horse's leg right here, one of its front legs here, that's actually visible. It's visible just between the edge of this shield and the edge of this guy's leg. So you can see that horse's leg sort of poking out there. And that's why I sort of draw like this. You know, I sort of draw in layers, because if I place it in early and I, you know, place the figures in correctly and think about all of these things, then you know, I can sort of place shields here and there. I can move them around without worrying about having to fill in the gaps of information. Whereas, you know, if I started drawing these guys in the foreground, you know, made them super detailed, and then I had to add figures as I go back, I mean, that's a valid method, but the problem I find with that personally is that it becomes pretty tricky then, because you've got all this detail that needs to go in between the figures, and if you've already covered it up with all this detail in the foreground here, then it's very hard to see where exactly that needs to go. And it, you know, I prefer to sketch the figures in very you know, very, very basically. And then, yeah, kind of like draw them in layers. So yeah, it's sort of like an X-ray vision going around there. But, you know, the other reason I do that is so that if I wanted to change anything, let's say this shield here, if I just wanted to like move that, or, you know, move anything else in the foreground, then I've already got a bit of the background drawing still sketched in. So I don't have to worry about making adjustments. I can make those adjustments without having to worry about disrupting anything behind the figures in the foreground. And the same goes for everything here too. Another reason you have to draw with, you know, I call it X-ray vision, but you know, because there's a figure right here, right? You can see this helmet where my index finger is, but his head is pretty much tucked away behind this figure at the front and this figure just behind him. And there's a third guy, but you don't see much of him, all right? He's just sort of hiding behind there. But I still need to draw his proportions, at least some of them, because you can see there's his shoulder plate coming out on the side. You know, he's going to be carrying a javelin as well. So, you know, I need to sort of figure out where his arm is going to be positioned in order to do that. So, you know, it's a lot of work, and, you know, some people might think I'm making a bit more work for myself than necessary, but, you know, I don't really think so. I think it's pretty necessary to draw the placement of the figures correctly, and then you can just sort of draw on top of it, you know, get your foundations in there, and then you're free to kind of just manipulate them how you want and change things as you need to change them. So that's how I draw it. It might take a bit longer, but that's how I do it. I don't really think that it takes that long. And these figures, because they're very basic, I mean, this guy's still, you can see how basic that anatomy is. There's no anatomy at all. It's just the proportions of his leg, torso. And it doesn't take me very long to draw that. So this is why in the early stages, I keep everything pretty basic, so that if I do need to move things around, if I do need to, you know, if I change my mind about something and I want to shift it here and there, then I can do that pretty easily. Like, I'm not going to get too attached to it because it didn't really take me that long to draw. But the overall piece did take a while. But, you know, I spend more time actually looking at the drawing than actually drawing it, especially in the early stages. Yeah, because, you know, I want to make sure that everything is exactly where I want it to be, and the figures are doing what I want them to do. If there's something that I'm not happy with, then I don't progress to the next stage. I have to fix whatever the issue is before I start adding detail. And that's why I stay in this sort of basic stage for quite a long time. I don't rush my drawings. Quick sketching I can do. I've got a sketchbook which I can just fill up in like no time. But when I'm working on a big piece, I take my time. And it's not because I'm a slow drawer. It's probably because I'm, if anything, a slow thinker. I just have to take my time and make sure that I like what I'm seeing. Because if there's something in there and I don't like what I see, it's going to be very, very difficult to change that when I start adding more and more detail. You know, there comes a point in the drawing where you've added so much detail that, you know, once you've found something wrong with the drawing, it's impossible to fix because you're just too far in at that point. If there's any problems with the perspective or proportions, or if you don't like what certain figures are doing, well, now is really the stage to take your time and assess it. And assess it a lot, right? Like I step away from the drawing quite often and I just look at it and I think to myself, okay, do I like where this is going? Do I like how this is looking? Am I happy with what this figure over here is doing? Am I happy with the perspective of this head? You know, there's a million questions I ask myself, and I have to think more than I draw. That's why this kind of drawing takes a while for me to do. The details, they kind of come naturally. Once everything's in its place, then the drawing process kind of speeds up a little bit. But yeah, right now I'm just in that stage where I have to make sure that the foundations are strong. Because if they're not, then it's going to be very, very difficult for me to change in the later stages. But anyway, that's a little bit of an update of how this drawing is progressing. I'll keep you guys informed about how the next stage goes.